Hey, Rumi, how you doing?
Good.
It is so good to see you. I have Caren Lissner, the Caren Lissner, here with me. And before we get into her story and before I formally introduce her, first and foremost, she was my freshman year roommate. And as often the case with freshman year roommates, we were randomly placed together, in this case, in part of the University of Pennsylvania's campus called King's Court. We shared a studio, literally one room. This is my memory. You walk in and ahead of us is a bay window. There was a lot of light in the room. And that's all. It was one open space. On the left-hand side when you walk in was my bed, and on the right-hand side was your bed. And there we were in this space together for our formative year at college.
Yes.
Yeah. What do you remember about that?
The first thing I always think of is that it was a different time. We didn't know anything about each other. And I know we'd exchange one or two written letters on lined paper.
Oh, yes.
And you were in North Jersey and you were in Fort Lee. And my mom said, that's the wealthiest part of New Jersey. My mom was very judgmental and I didn't know anything about it or about you. And I was like, oh my God, she's going to be a horrible snob. But we didn't know anything about each other, and there were good things to that. And now I know freshmen meet ahead of time. At least they can talk on and on and on. But it wasn't a tiny room, so that was good. It wasn't huge, but it wasn't tiny. This was one of the older dorms. It was on the edge of campus. But we had the bay windows. That was the cool thing about our room. And we each had a bed on the side, a little bed, and there was nowhere else. So guests would come in and just sit on the bed next to us. And
Right.
Totally fine. I remember we did coordinate our bedspreads. I think we had peach or something like that.
That sounds right. It was a peachy time, definitely.
It was, but it was exciting. I feel like we got to know so many things about each other on the floor. It was young men and women, and then we also probably didn't know a lot. There was probably a lot we were hiding. I know I was hiding some things. It was interesting because all of us would talk late into the night. People were from all over the country. There was a lot to learn. I learned more, I think, from everyone on the floor than I learned in class.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I would agree with that. And just for the record, Fort Lee is where I grew up, and it does have that reputation. We were very middle class. Money was not flowing, although I was fortunate. I never wanted for anything. It did become a part of my lore, though, at college. Anyway, that's another story for another day. But yes, so here we were, freshman year, and one of the first things that I noticed about Caren is, while I can write, Caren is a writer. And what I mean by that is she always had a notebook with her. She was always journaling. She always had writing with her. She was working at the school paper. It was just in her DNA. And so as you learn more about her, you'll see how that not at all surprisingly carried through into her career. So she left Penn and became a news editor and reporter in New Jersey. Among the most impressive things she's done is she is a published author, including her first novel, which is called Carrie Pilby, Carriepilby. It's about a 19-year-old genius who graduated early from Harvard but doesn't know how to date or make friends. And then, who can say this? Her book was turned into a movie with Nathan Lane, Belle Pauley, Gabrielle Byrne, Jason Ritter. So a full-blown movie production, which is just really mind-bogglingly cool. She's published humorous and serious essays and stories in the New York Times, Atlantic.com, Washington Post. And then bringing us to the podcast today, within the last year or so, Caren, before it got published, shared an essay with me that she was working on for the Pennsylvania Gazette, which is UPenn's magazine. And it's called Close Your Eyes. And in it, Caren chronicles the summer after freshman year that she spent with her mom. Her mom had developed some mental health issues that resulted in challenges with maintaining housing. And so Caren spent the summer with her, as well as some other summers, actually living out of a car. I did not know this until Caren shared the essay with me. So it was a mix of feelings and thoughts. Holy crap. How didn't I know that this was happening? How didn't I know that when we said goodbye freshman year and said hello again sophomore year that she had been living out of a car with her family? What did I miss? How did I miss it? What could I have done differently? And of course, so sorry that you went through that. And it's really brave of you to share because it's not a topic that people often share about. So that really brings us to today. You know, I asked Caren if she would be open to joining me on the podcast to share more about that story and to continue to expand the understanding of what it means to be marginalized, what it means to live as an outsider. So thank you so much for being here today, Rumi.
Thank you for having me. I love the podcast. It's so interesting.
Oh, thank you. That does mean a lot to me. And I don't know if you've noticed, but I'm wearing a concert t-shirt.
Is that
Why
a
do you
band?
It's not for a band, it's for a festival. It's called the French Quarter Festival. It's held annually in April in New Orleans. It's free and it's multiple stages going at the same time with all different kinds of music, with some names you might recognize, but mostly with local bands, anything from rock to jazz to Zydeco. It's super cool. And it was an annual pre-COVID tradition that I joined my dad and my stepmom on and their friends, which became my friends. So yes, this is a 2017 French Quarter Festival concert t-shirt. Why would I be wearing that for you today?
Because when I met you, you were wearing a concert t-shirt. And by the way, I don't know if we gave anyone the context that this was in the 90s. You were wearing, I think, Depeche Mode. And I always feel uncool because people always know more about music. I used to listen to the top 40, but if it wasn't in the countdown, I didn't know it. So it was a black concert t-shirt. So I thought you were
Oh, that was
pretty
Depeche Mode
cool.
then, for sure, yes.
Yeah, and I knew the one song, and I think I asked you about it. And again, this is because we didn't have the internet to look stuff up. I said, why do they sing "You and I should get along so awfully"? And so you
Yes.
explained it.
And so you can be honest with me now. Did you think it was cool or dorky that I was wearing a concert t-shirt?
No, I thought it was cool.
Okay. I'm glad you didn't think it was horribly dorky, even though it probably was. It's super kind of you. So I told a bit about what you did professionally. What else might you want to add to what I shared?
I always did want to write. I think it's a good escape. It helps me imagine anyone's worst pain can become a story to help others. So it is a bit of a survival tactic, but it is something I've always loved since I used to bring home armloads of Judy Blume books in the 80s. I loved her straightforward narrative. It felt like you were having a conversation with another 12-year-old or 13-year-old like yourself. And I always wanted to write like that. But I was interested in journalism too. I'm curious. I like taking really complex topics and finding a way to make people realize why they should care. And that's a hard thing to do because people read a headline and get to something else unless you catch them right away. So I have written essays that people can find. Some are humorous, some are serious. I've had some in the New York Times, some in lesser places. I have a website. I always wanted to write young adult books, as I noted. So in college and after, I wrote 4 manuscripts that didn't go anywhere. And when I was a single girl in northern New Jersey, working as a temp in New York, finally I got frustrated one day and I wrote this rant. And I decided to turn it into a novel about a young woman who's very smart, but she doesn't know how to date. She doesn't really know how to make friends. It's like where I was in the late 90s. There was a chick lit trend in publishing, meaning books about young single women. There was a Bridget Jones and other things. So I happened to just, for the first time in my life, be at the beginning of a trend. I wrote about this young woman who graduates from Harvard at 19. She's very smart, but all of a sudden she doesn't have the structure of school. How does she date? How does she fall in love? How does she make friends? I always felt socially behind and a little bit isolated. And so I exaggerated who I was and made this character who just can't relate to nuance and things and shades of gray. And I'd always had good luck with humor as opposed to serious writing, so I tried to make it funny. I was working for a weekly newspaper in New Jersey. That was my full-time job. I was making like $18,000 a year or something. But I would come home and work on this novel, and I had a rare 4 days off for the holidays, and I was just trying to see if this would go anywhere, and I had this idea. What happened was I actually saw a personal ad around that time that was for a guy who was engaged but looking to cheat to make sure he was confident in his girlfriend. And I thought this was horrible. The poor girl. I put myself in her shoes. This was in the back of the Village Voice or something. And so I worked that into my book. I was going to have my main character go on the date just to bust this guy. And what occurred to me in the middle of the night was, what if she's attracted to him and realizes he's not terrible? And that's where the book took off, and it studied these moral shades of gray, and this genius character suddenly didn't feel like she knew everything. And I wrote, I think, 40 pages on that in one night, that she's falling in love with this guy who wants to cheat on his fiance. And so this book, I called it Carrie Pilby. That was the nerdy character's name. It sold. I got a 2-book deal. I wrote another book after that. It got optioned 3 times by different movie companies who wanted to make it a TV show. One was 2 female filmmakers who said, we don't have a lot of money, but I've always thought about this since it came out. I'd like to make an indie film. And they were the ones that ended up doing it little by little. It was made into a movie that you can find. It was on Netflix. Now you can stream it. But the young and old seemed to like it equally, and it was very well done. I didn't write the screenplay, but I worked with the woman who did. It came out really great. It's a fun film to watch.
It really is. And I got to go to the screening with you, which was
You
one of
did.
my favorite moments.
And even your mommy was helping us along. She was a big supporter. Even in college, she was a cheerleader because she was a creative person and you were. And I am grateful to you both because you were rooting me on. And we all need people to root us on in this world.
Yes, I definitely was. And my mom I would describe her as your number one fan. Really just was so proud of and impressed by what you were doing. And I remember she got a credit at the end of the movie. And then what about something that lights you up personally, maybe something that people don't traditionally know about you?
I've always been a shy person. I don't know if that's people's impression when they meet me because I have to force myself. But even to this day, I don't think that ever leaves you. I have to call people for quotes for news articles or for different reasons or even just make a new friend. And inside, I'm like, what if they reject me? So I think there are things about me that people would not expect. I guess one thing is that I really like music and I've had songs I've written, but I have no talent. So they're just sitting there. Someday I'd like to get them out there.
I had no idea about that. So if I may, when you say songs, you mean both music and lyrics?
Mostly the lyrics, and that's the problem. If you can't perform, it's going to sit there. And I've actually paid 2 people who are friends who can play by ear to do them, and they slowed down a fast song. I think you really have to do it yourself. So someday, I don't know, I wrote a 1-act play, I could put them in that, or just, I want to do something with them.
I am by no means an accomplished musician, and sometimes ignorance is bliss. If you ever want to throw me the lyrics, if there's anything.
I will!
Okay.
I mean, maybe, well, who knows? Maybe I could get them out there.
Cool. Well, perhaps we will collaborate, but no matter what, I hope you get those songs out there. I had no idea that you'd written songs, but knowing how you write, that does not surprise me. So
thank you.
Yeah.
And a couple are funny too. Some
that also doesn't surprise me. Yeah.
Serious.
So what are your pronouns?
She and her.
Okay. And as we start to move into your story, what do you want the audience to know about your intersectionality, who you are in the navigating your career as an outsider story?
One of the things I was hiding in college because people just did not understand back then. And I think there's a lot they don't understand now. My mom was suffering from mental illness that got worse and there was no diagnosis. I feel like this is in some ways a common Gen X story because people had some kind of trauma in their family and no one to tell and nowhere to learn about it. So my mom years later was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, but with paranoia. But it just crept up slowly when I was young, and I just knew something was off. And eventually my parents got divorced when I was in 8th grade. So we were never wealthy, and she didn't plan well. And at some point we were living in cars. And this happened a couple of summers while I was in college. My mom would find cheap rentals, but sometimes she couldn't find a place she afforded in time. We would either stay at cheap motels or some nights we'd end up in a car between places. I remember coming back to college at the University of Pennsylvania, where some people are very wealthy. And I heard somebody behind me on Amtrak. It was a dad talking to his grown-up kids. And he said, I don't understand why anyone could be homeless. They have all these programs for them. And that was the attitude. In the 80s, people were either lazy and not trying to work themselves out of homelessness or mental illness, or they could be wealthy. And there's a lot between that. A lot of people cannot help their situations. I don't believe anyone wants to be. That's more work to get up in the morning and ask for money all day than it is to go sit in front of a computer.
Yeah. Why would I choose that if it were really a choice?
Yeah, exactly.
You know,
and the benefits people get, it's humiliating to be on benefits, having known lots of people. It's not given out easily. So I was in college. I didn't really expect anyone to understand that some summers we would go from living in a car. And somehow we managed to exchange written letters over summers. And it's amazing how everyone knew how to write so well. I still have some from guys on our floor, friends, and from you and some of our other friends that first summer after freshman year, all talking about what we were doing. But I would hide things. I didn't really have an address. I had a post office box that things were forwarded to for a while. I don't think anyone knew I was writing these things from a car.
No, there's no, I mean, I sure didn't.
Yeah, I would understand, or they would get frustrated and say, why is that? And one of the most annoying things anyone can hear is, why don't you just? There's some easy solution and we're just ignoring it. It's like people who are struggling with infertility. Oh, just adopt. Yeah, you can go pluck a kid and they'll give one right to you. Most people are not in difficult situations because they're ignoring some obvious solution.
Yeah. It's interesting. On the podcast in my mind, I've always had this idea that we would start with and focus on the historically marginalized communities because there's richness in those stories and they're so important to tell to create more understanding. And then also all of us feel like outsiders at some point, and it's really a much broader spectrum. Ruth Rathblot talked about it in the episode she and I did together. People are constantly hiding, and it's not just sexual orientation, race. People are hiding health issues, family issues, financial issues, etc. And this is the first podcast I'm doing where we really step outside a bit. I'm really grateful to you for bringing this story about mental illness, poverty, housing challenges, housing insecurity more into the open, because I don't think it's shared very often, and I think it's so important. So would you be comfortable, I'm just thinking about that essay that you shared with me, which was published in this last year in the Pennsylvania Gazette. It was about the summer between freshman and sophomore year when you were living with your family out of the car.
It took me like 30 years to write it, and I always had in the back of my mind, someday I'll pitch this. So the Pennsylvania Gazette is the alumni magazine of the University of Pennsylvania. So I've written articles for the Penn Gazette, and I wrote this essay that came out last summer, and I got an overwhelming response. Usually I write stuff and nothing happens. At least 10 people looked up how to email me and emailed me in response, and I didn't have my email at the end of the article or the essay. I wrote about my friends didn't know I was living in a car. I just picked one summer so I could tell the story a little bit. There was a song that was #1 that summer, Hold On for One More Day. And that was the song I listened to a lot on my Walkman because it gave me a little hope.
Real quick, prior to this, you had been living with your mom and dad in the suburbs, right?
Yeah, so I grew up in the Jersey suburbs, and we were the standard boomer family. My parents met at a dance in their early 20s. They were both high school teachers. They were born within a year of each other at the end of World War II, so they were from neighboring communities in New Jersey. It seemed like a good match. They had the girl and the boy, and they bought a starter home. My mom left teaching, and my dad kept teaching. We had 2 cars. On a teacher's salary, I'm sure they got a little help, but their relatives were second-generation immigrants, so they weren't dirt poor, but nobody in our family was wealthy. They were immigrants from Newark and towns like that. And my dad and mom bought this cute little green house in Matawan, New Jersey. We had a 2-car garage, and my mom always said she wanted a better school system. We moved around, but that was part of her illness too. She was never happy anywhere. I think she just always felt people were conspiring against her. And that was hard for me because I'd make friends and have to leave them. And back then you might as well have been moving to Russia or something if you left your town, because there was no internet. People didn't really keep in touch. So we moved around. My mom had mental illness that got worse, and finally my dad left. He moved a few towns away, but so that was in 8th grade, right before high school. So we didn't have as much money as before, and the problem was my mom did not plan, and I'm an obsessive planner now because I don't want to wait till the last minute for anything. She would yell at me that I was being a goody-goody, and I'd say, why don't you look for a house today? And she'd be like, oh, we got plenty of time. And then we'd have to leave a place without having anywhere to move. And she also was getting alimony and child support once I got to college. She didn't get it for me anymore. Once my sibling was 18, all she had was a little alimony. So when we would stay with her in the summers, she didn't have a lot of money, but she did have a car. So she would look for these resorts that were falling apart or whatever. We ended up in the Catskills, which was on the way out in the 90s. I have good memories of visiting the Catskills. It was just like Dirty Dancing. It was a fun place to stay as a kid, but it was on the way out, sadly. So there were all these communities of bungalows that were cheap to rent in the summer. So that summer in particular, we slept in the car some nights. My mom would pull into a mall parking lot, and we had a dog, which I wasn't going to give up our dog. Our dog brought us a lot of love, but that made it harder to get a place too. Some people had no pet rules. So we were living in a car, and we would find these bungalow resorts. And that summer, that's where we ended up. And there was one my mom found, but it was a little dirty, and I actually preferred to sleep in the car. And there was an owner who said to me, hey, there's an abandoned one. You can sleep in the empty one. So I actually slept in a different bungalow than my family because they were just sleeping on a couple of mattresses in one that was broken. It had some bugs. It wasn't like roaches or anything, but I slept in a different one. So the essay was just about how I went from living in a dorm and having all these friends from different backgrounds to hiding that I was in poverty. And then I wanted to get back to college as soon as I could because that was my stability. And I got back to school, and I put my stereo back on the dresser, and I had a view of Center City, Philadelphia, and it was a marked difference. I wasn't living place to place. And even when my mom would find a place that she could afford, she would always come up with some reason why we couldn't stay there. And then we'd be back in the car. And then eventually she couldn't afford the car. For many years, she was living on the streets of New York, which was unthinkable because as a kid in the suburbs, I was afraid of New York. She didn't have any experience with the city. Things happened gradually, and she was not in her right mind. I don't think she would have wanted to go from living in houses to being homeless.
Yeah. So you come back sophomore year. what did I miss or what did we miss, meaning the people around you?
I don't know. I thought we all had our problems, and I wasn't very forthcoming. I couldn't talk about anything because I was used to, when I was young, being bullied, and that kind of trickled down a little bit. Like I never got an 80s haircut like everyone else had, and kids used to pick on me for that. I just had long Brady Bunch hair, and it was the 80s, and everyone had their wings and whatever.
Mhm.
So I got to college and people were really nice and different, but I was just used to the time of being picked on if I didn't have designer clothes or whatever. So I kept a lot of stuff to myself. I was afraid of dating. I didn't want anyone to get close enough to see me and find out things about me. So I would talk about some things, but I just did not tell anyone a lot about my financial situation. I didn't want people to know how poor I was. I think some people picked up on that I was struggling.
Yeah, I said I had a bunch of mixed emotions and thoughts when I first read the essay. The first one was, how did I miss that? What could I have done differently? I'm sorry if I missed anything. That's all I can say. I just didn't.
It's fine. I think all of us our age probably have something to apologize for to someone we knew in school, and it's not our fault. We either didn't know or we were jerks or whatever. You weren't at all a bully, and I thought you were kind, but I think we both hid things, and I think most people were hiding things. I didn't feel like I could just unburden myself. I was closed off about everything.
Yeah, well, we definitely all had our walls. I was going through uncertainty about my sexual orientation, and that was not at all visible. I kept that very
Right.
close to the vest. So, yes, I think we all did have walls up. Was there any part of you that, while you didn't have the words yet and you did have walls up, that hoped that someone would just dig deep enough to crash through the wall and really ask the questions?
Sometimes it frustrated me that conversations I would have with friends did not go deeper, but I also would have had to be vulnerable, and I was afraid to do that. I didn't know how to make that happen.
To say that you were carrying a lot is an understatement. And then when you take into account the fact that in the 90s, there was so little understanding about what you were going through culturally, societally. And then that age, we're just entering college and we're all figuring stuff out and
Yeah, we were
managing our own stuff. It's a lot of things that converge at the same time. This may be obvious, but vulnerability, you were afraid. What do you feel like you were afraid of specifically?
being picked on and judged. Besides being bullied in school, there was my mom. I think she was afraid constantly of being abandoned by me. And so she would take things, yell at me about them. I didn't want her to know anything about my life because she was very judgy. So I was always hiding things. I just got used to it. I feel like the people I became closest to on our floor were the ones who also were being raised primarily by a single parent. Some women our age who I could tell were just in a different world. They didn't really struggle for anything. You could see the haves and the nots who had two parents, who had one parent who went home for every break and who stayed in the dorm because it wasn't comfortable or easy to go home.
Yeah. So then as we start to intersect this with your career, I would say that your career really started in college. You were constantly working different jobs in order to make ends meet and to start to try to break this cycle of poverty. Tell us a little bit about what you were doing in college from a working standpoint.
I would take anything that I could theoretically make money at. And because it was a little bit privileged, there were some easy jobs. There were work-study jobs. One of the good ones was security. You could sit in the front of the dorm and you had to look at people's ID cards. It was even before people had to put their ID through a reader. And you could still study while you were sitting there.
Right.
So I liked that. And so it wasn't working in a coal mine. It was a minimum wage back then when it was $5.25 an hour. Of course, I got financial aid, and there was a time before our parents' generation or during when only the wealthiest kids could afford to go to a competitive college. And then the GI Bill started and financial aid started. College became less elitist. Maybe the elitists were still funding it so that people like me could go who had nothing. But so one time I took graveyard shifts doing security that other people didn't want. And then I could sit there all night, study, and make some money. It was all night long, but I did it.
You did the typing thing?
Yes, that was funny. Our dorm room phone number freshman year happened to come out to the word Tukey. So I decided to name the company Tukey Typing. And I put all these ads around campus saying, let me type your paper for you. One night, And actually, I told you about this in the morning. A guy called me and he said he was desperate. He needed a paper typed by 9 in the morning. He was religious Jewish and he said he couldn't, maybe it was Friday or sometime when he said he
Sabbath, yeah.
wasn't allowed to work, but I could do the typing. He said he'd pay me $20 an hour, which was a lot of money then. In the middle of the night, I went to the campus computer room. I hadn't saved enough for my own computer yet, and that was a dream. And I typed his paper. And I saw you the next morning. Maybe we were getting breakfast with some friends, and you were like, you made $60 overnight? You were impressed that overnight I had $60.
And you're working at the Daily Pennsylvanian at the newspaper.
Yeah, and I got a lot of good experience there. That wasn't a paid thing, but I liked it there.
So this kind of constant hustle on top of all of our academic work that we had, how did that feel for you juggling all of that?
It was okay. I think what always saved me was my dreams. Someday I'm going to get out of here. Someday I'm not going to move around. Someday. I don't know how people get through things like that if they don't have dreams. You've got to come up with some kind of creative dream or project. A lot of them, maybe. I've always lived in a fantasy world. Even as a kid, I would think of stories from things, and maybe that's how I survived. So yeah, I was always hustling.
Yeah.
Another thing I did was I graduated a semester early to save money. Maybe I saved because I wasn't doing a lot of social things.
Yeah.
I did try to go to fraternity parties with you and our friends sometimes, but I wasn't enough out of my shell to really enjoy them.
Yeah.
So maybe on a Saturday night, I might write a story or do a work study job no one else wanted instead of going to the beer parties that were so popular.
Yeah. And then, so I'm going to try to summarize when we connected to talk about the discussion today. You graduated with about $1,000 in your pocket.
Right.
You do all of this work and now you have $1,000. You first moved into a place in West Philly with a rent of something around $250 a month. And you continued to hustle, work as many jobs as you could. And while there, you saved another $1,000, which then allowed you to get a place in Westchester for $330 a month. You've continued to hustle, work, and save. And you wind up in Hoboken with your own place, about $800 a month. And now you're able to bring roommates in, but it's your space and you can split the rent.
It was kind of cool. I was never wealthy, but I was stable and I was able to help my family too. At some point, I was giving a lot of money to my mom.
Yeah. And then you told me that you were at one point working a newspaper job that paid around $17,000 a year while temping at night for $25 an hour at a law firm doing some kind of proofreading.
That was it. They would call me, and if I could do it, I would. They'd send a car sometimes if it was late. So it was cool. I'd go into the city, make that money overnight, and come home.
And I said, when did you sleep? And you said, I don't know. I got an hour or two and I was fine because I was in my 20s. But seriously, that's impressive. A little, I don't know how you did it, but I understand why you did it. And I'm impressed that you did it.
Thank you. But I knew someday I wouldn't be able to do that. I might have a family someday. I could be disabled. You can be disabled at any time. I just figured out this was the time to do it. Life wouldn't always be like that.
And I would imagine that you had this fear of poverty hanging over your shoulder, motivating you the entire time.
Yes, I did. And I was always squirreling a little money away.
And then tell me how you think this hustle, this commitment, persistence, how did that serve you in your publishing career?
I think it did a lot because that's a lot of hustling and a lot of rejection. I had to keep writing all the time. I wrote 4 novels that were rejected, but each time, this was again before the internet, I had to ship them in the mail and wait for a response. But I had to keep hustling. I always had to have some irons in the fire because if you spend 2 years or 5 years writing a book and nobody wants it and you realize it's not that good or someone's doing the same thing, you don't want to not have anything and start from scratch. So I always had a few different projects. Most of them did not go anywhere, but I had my dreams and I learned to hustle and I learned not to wait till the last minute or have all my eggs in one basket. I was always doing a few things at once and eventually a book worked out.
How often were you submitting something?
Often. Some of it was just essays, but I usually had a book in progress. I even wrote 5 screenplays that didn't go anywhere.
Wow.
I still do. I still have long piles of things I want to get to that I can't because I have still a full-time job. People think your book gets made into a movie and you're rich. I did get a lump sum and that was nice, but it's expensive to live in this world.
And on a gut level, what percentage of all of the submissions, essays, books, et cetera, that you put out there, what percent do you think you actually closed on, so to speak?
I've had a lot of stuff published, little things and big things. And there were some things I had to give up on, mainly the books, because that's a commitment. You don't get to have your book published just because you worked really hard on it or you're a really good person. Somebody's got to be with you holding your hand. And that's why movies don't get made from books that often either. You've got to have someone who's as much in love with your project as you are, because they've got to then deal with the rejection. They've got to sit there and edit again. But most things got rejected. It was worth it for the chance. You never know what's going to happen, who's going to see your stuff. And 99% of the time, nothing happens. I published essays early on in the Times, and nobody reached out and said, I want to make you famous. I want to publish whatever you want to write. That's a dream. You get so famous that anyone wants your stuff. So I would say the majority of time spent did not result in publication, but I wanted to keep doing it. And I had so many ideas, and I wanted to have my dream validated, to put creative things out there. And I still hope to do that.
Do you feel like you managed, for the most part, not to take the rejection personally? Because I'm not hearing that, but maybe you're just not saying it.
I just don't. I think there were one or two times when I really had something that I thought was going to do well, that I got sad that I got rejected. But I just know everyone has such different tastes. I don't feel like somebody should be paying me $1 million to write my stories, but I do think sometimes some of the essays and things do help people in some way.
So that we have the hustle piece of your experiences growing up that really served you well in your career. And then there's an empathy that I feel like you have for people that has also manifested in your career in some ways. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's good, because there was a feeling for a while that journalists are elitists and come from Ivy League schools and are rich and don't know what it's like to live paycheck to paycheck. And this, like a lot of assumptions, is silly. And it was put out there by people who don't want anyone to read what's in the media. I would say the majority of journalists are not wealthy commentators on Fox. They're people just quietly doing a job starting at $17,000 a year. I'm not a famous person, but I've probably written hundreds of thousands of small articles, and I have written about people who are homeless. I've found people's missing pets and all kinds of things just by writing. And I do have an empathy, and I do understand. I don't feel like people have to go through explaining to me why they're homeless or in poverty. I've done a lot of stories on people who are homeless in my area. And I have had people reach out and say, I never understood why someone was homeless before, and I always blamed them. And now, thanks to your story, I understand a little better.
Yeah, that's amazing. And going back a little bit to the article that you wrote for the Penn Gazette, and you said that people actually tracked you down to give you feedback. That never happens, virtually never happens, but it happened. And I think really speaks to you bringing light to a story that people were really wanting to hear more about and striking a chord. What were some of the things people said to you when they did finally track you down?
Well, there was a lot of people, I think, who had felt the same way on campus. They weren't wealthy and they were fish out of water, and they wished there had been more support for that. There is more support for that now on campus, but back then, on the weekends, there was no dining hall. There is now. The dining hall was something I think financial aid covered if you have financial aid, but it didn't cover the weekends. I remember I had a standing snack Saturday morning. I would go next door to Wawa, which was near our dorm, and I would get strawberry milk, which was hard to find, but I loved it. And I would get a banana, and it was nutritious, but I think it cost $2. And then at dinner, I went to the food trucks, and that was $4.25. Maybe I'd get water or a soda. So I would spend under $10 a day on food. And I think that's the kind of thing people were writing to me about, how they felt like they were the only poor person on campus and they didn't want to reveal it. They felt out of place. And that's what they connected with in my story.
Yeah. And you're modest, but I'm guessing they thanked you too.
They probably did. I don't know. And I was glad, because a lot of times I write things I have no idea if it resonates. I have some instinct for whether something is readable, but something that I went through is not necessarily going to be of interest to someone else.
Yeah.
And I have to pare it down. And that's one reason a lot of people don't get published. They may have a great story, but if they don't write it in such a way that you can read it, no one's going to stick with it. So I never know what's going to resonate.
It's a story that took you 30 years to write, and not surprising, and also beautiful to hear that it really connected with people in the ways that it did.
Yeah. And that makes me feel a little better about not working in a coal mine or being a surgeon.
So we've talked about a lot of themes in your career. I have a new segment this season called The Thrive Takeaway. And if listeners only remember one thing from our conversation today, one thought, one piece of advice, what would you want them to carry with them so that they can thrive in their own careers?
Know that your story is important and that you have a story to tell, and it may help others, even if it's something you're struggling with. Someday you will be able to help others somewhere. And if you are a creative person, don't feel that you're not worthy of telling your story, writing a song, making something out of clay, posting something on the internet, because all stories matter, I feel like.
Yeah, and I'll just add, it's your Thrive takeaway, but I'm just struck by your persistence, you're not giving up, and I think there's something magical in tapping into your creativity and just continuing to have at it in the way that you did that I really admire.
you.
Yeah. All right, everyone, that's today's Thrive takeaway. If you're listening and it got you thinking, I invite you to explore your own path to thriving in your career and beyond. My free Thriving Assessment offers a gentle but powerful way to get clarity on where you're excelling and where you can increase joy, fulfillment, and impact. It takes just minutes and gives you instant personalized results. You can find it at shantijoygold.com in the upper right-hand corner. All right, let's move directly into the other segment that I always look forward to, musics, as we've been talking about. Big part of my life. It was a big part of our life at college. I think that music, like storytelling, really taps into some deeper truths. So the segment is, it's my podcast, so there will be music. If there were a song that you could put in a time capsule and preserve at all costs for future generations, Caren Lissner, what would it be and why?
The one I thought of when you asked me that was Stressed Out by 21 Pilots. And I really wanted to come up with something from our 80s childhood because I thought there was a real explosion of colorful music. But some of the songs I like weren't really representative of anything in particular. And I find that it's really hard to find a new act that resonates now because so much has been done before. But a lot of young people are into 21 Pilots. It's a drummer and a singer-songwriter. But they really come up with some creative lyrics. Some are kind of basic, but they came out with the song Stressed Out that became really their first radio-friendly hit. And it came out just before the pandemic. And I think maybe they tapped into something. It was a song that was just about wishing for childhood when things were simple. I know it resonated with a lot of young people, and then I went back, as happens, and looked at their discography, and they have a lot of really great songs about struggling with depression, taking control of it. Finding music you can relate to really gets you through, and I think someday in the future, if someone looked back at that song, they could get a sense of how people were feeling right before the quarantine era, maybe in this time we live in.
It taps into some of the vulnerabilities. There's the "My name's blurry face,"
right?
And I care what you think. That's that vulnerable thing, and it talks a lot about money. Between student loans and tree homes, we all would choose the latter. So it's got that reference to student loans, which was very apropos to our conversation today.
Yeah, as one of the lyrics, I thought that's a little on the nose, but not a lot of people are writing about that.
Absolutely. And one of my favorite ones, this is just me and quirky, there's a line that says, "I wish I didn't have to rhyme every time I sang." And it's the one line in the song that doesn't rhyme with anything.
That's funny. Yeah,
I like that. Cool. Well, we will add that to the Spotify playlist. I love that addition. It's a great song. So thank you for sharing it. And now, as we're coming to the end, if you could just let people know more about what you're doing in the world and where people can find out more.
I'm working on a memoir called How We Became Homeless, which is about downward mobility in the 80s, 90s. Through recently, Gen X hasn't asserted itself in the memoir world. So I'm writing this memoir about growing up in the suburbs, living with my mom, and ending up in a car and trying to help my mom when she ended up in the streets of New York City, which was for a long time. How does that even happen? It's crazy. But there are rules. You can't make someone get off the street. There are exceptions. I had to find them. So it's all about that. For someone who lived on the street and had a lot of medical problems, she lived a long time. But now that she's gone, I felt ready to finally put this into a book. And I'm going over it with different people to get it into shape. And then it will go out on submission. So I'm hoping someday How We Became Homeless will be a memoir people can enjoy and find some humor in, because nobody wants to read depressing all the time.
Yeah. That's such an important story. And, it's one thing to live in broken down places and in a car, and it's another thing to actually be homeless. I think that'll be an important book for everyone.
Yeah, I don't have a publisher. So my job, again, just like 30 or 20 years ago, I got to get it into the best fighting shape and win against the competition with everything else out there. And But people can put my name in CarenLissner.com. There aren't that many Karens with a C. I'm not that hard to find if someone's intrigued by this and wants to read any of my humorous or serious writing.
Yeah, I'm going to just spell it for anyone who's listening, and it'll also be in the show notes. But Caren spells her name, as she said, Caren, and her last name, Lissner, Lissner. And then we'll point people toward Carrie Pilby, the book, Carrie Pilby, the movie. your Penn Gazette essay, which is just so worth the read and really the
Thank you. And it is online.
Yeah, and I'm so grateful because it's what brought you here to the podcast today. That kind of dorky kid that walked in with a Depeche Mode concert T-shirt freshman year of college is really glad these years later to be sitting here with you and having this conversation.
We're still getting to know each other because that's how life is. You don't always know someone when you're young, and I'm
Absolutely.
glad to know you and to see what you've done. It's cool and interesting.
Thank you. And I feel the same way. You're the only person I know who's published a book that was then turned into a movie. And what you're doing now is just really so important and brave. And I'm glad to know you and so glad to have an opportunity to share you and your story a little bit more with the listeners. So thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for letting me talk about it. I've never really gotten to go into detail about my college life, and maybe we'll get into that more someday because it was an interesting time. But
No doubt.
Having me on to talk about everything, and thanks for your support.
Of course, I'm honored that you chose to share it here. I really am. All right, everyone, that brings this episode of Stories We Haven't Shared to a close. I believe stories are our humanity waiting to be shared, and listening makes it possible. Thanks so much for being here today by our virtual campfire. Until next time, and thank you again to Caren Lissner. See you, Rumi.
Bye. I was hoping for s'mores, but next time.
Maybe next time.
S'mores.
S'mores.